Today, we're going to be hearing from four incredibly impressive digital rights activists: Catherine Muya from Kenya, Gideon Sarpong from Ghana, Mary Bagdasarian from Armenia, and Paula Galvez from Peru. They'll be speaking about specific research and advocacy projects that they've been implementing over the past year as part of the Open Internet for Democracy Leaders Program. And more than that, they'll be sharing with us their thoughts about what needs to be done to strengthen the community of digital democracy and internet freedom defenders globally. So it's going to be a great conversation. My name is Daniel O'Malley. I'm the Deputy Editor and Digital Policy Specialist at the Center for International Media Assistance, CIMA, which is a media development think tank housed at the National Endowment for Democracy. It's going to be my honor to serve as the moderator today for this panel, which has been organized by the Open Internet for Democracy Initiative, which is a project that is co-led by CIMA, the National Democratic Institute, NDI, and the Center for International Private Enterprise, CIPE. First, I would just want to give you a little outline of how today's event's going to unfold. We will devote approximately a half hour to a moderated conversation with the panelists. There will be no presentations. Rather, I've identified a series of topics for the panelists to address, and I've asked the panelists to engage directly with each other when appropriate. We really want to have an engaging discussion for you. We're also keen to engage with you, the audience that's joining us today. We've reserved the final 20 minutes or so for questions. We'll be using Zoom's Q&A feature, and I'd encourage you to use that to ask any questions you have at any point during the conversation, and we'll do our best to get through as many of those as possible today. Now, before we dive into the conversation, I want to take this opportunity to briefly give you an overview of the Open Internet for Democracy Initiative. So next slide, please. The Open Internet for Democracy Initiative is a joint project by CIMA, NDI, and CIPE that aims to bring a multi-sectoral approach to promoting internet freedom by bringing our different constituencies, the private sector, news media stakeholders, civil society, and political figures. The goal is to build a diverse, multi-sectoral network of open internet advocates who champion the democratic values and principles that should guide the future development of the internet. When advocates from civil society, news media, and the private sector collaborate for a unified cause, the arguments we make are stronger and the chances of success are higher. That's the overall goal. Next slide, please. One of the main components of this is our Open Internet for Democracy Leaders Program. This is a non-residential fellowship program. This past year, you can see the 8 individuals on your screen from around the world who participated in the program. Each individual develops a research or advocacy project looking at a specific issue related to internet freedom in their area. And the program creates a platform to share some of that localized knowledge at a higher level, at a regional or global level. Due to time constraints, we'll be hearing from just 4 of these leaders this year, but I guarantee you that the work that each and every one of the people you see on your screen is really important and really interesting, and I wish we had more time to go into all of them. Next slide, please. And finally, I'd like to share some of the initiative's flagship resources. The first is the Democratic Principles for an Open Internet. These principles were developed collectively with input from more than 100 digital rights partners, and they serve as an advocacy tool that organizations can utilize in pushing governments, the private sector, and even civil society to adhere to universal human rights through open internet principles and standards. It's really a guiding document for the values that this initiative espouses. And the second is the Open Internet for Democracy Advocacy Playbook, which is a complementary guide that provides democracy activists around the world tools and tips about how they can actually implement projects and campaigns to defend internet freedom. It was actually written by one of the cohorts of Open Internet leaders, so it's really tailored to the needs of the people on the ground who are doing this work and takes into account experience of people who've done this in the past. So it's a really great advocacy tool. These resources, as well as information about all of the current open internet leaders and the past ones, are available on the website. If you haven't, I would encourage you to check it out. You can do that at https:// openinternet.global. So that's HTTPS openinternet.global. Okay, we can move on from the slide deck now. And now let's turn to the main exciting portion of this conversation. According to Freedom House's Freedom on the Net report, internet freedom has been on the decline for the past 10 years. And, we know that digital authoritarians are working together to do this in part. Earlier this month, China and Russia signed an accord, really an unprecedented accord, to coordinate more intensely at the ITU, the UN specialized body that is responsible for all matters related to ICT and the internet. And ultimately, what these two governments are trying to do is promote a concept of digital sovereignty. Hi, everyone. I apologize for that. I think that the digital authoritarians heard what I was saying about them and they cut me out. But I just wanted to talk about, basically, we also have challenges from private sector companies and missteps. The case of Myanmar is one that has been on the minds of civil society activists around the world. So ultimately, these challenges are difficult. The stakes could never be higher. Many countries around the world are looking at, which kind of vision of the internet do we want to take? Is it one that promotes multi-stakeholder engagement and engagement with civil society, or is it one that goes in the direction of the digital authoritarians? And so that's where I want to start. And I want to start today with you, Mary. First of all, Mary Bagdasaryan is a human rights lawyer from Armenia who focuses on digital rights issues at the intersection of law and technology. And she recently completed her master's in law at the University of Pennsylvania. Over the past year, you've been doing research on the privacy implications of a number of COVID tracking apps launched in Southeastern Europe. But I also want to talk to you about research about a digital rights law, proposed digital laws in Armenia that would actually have the unintended consequence of cracking down on press freedom. And I just wanted to know, from your experience, what have you learned about the state of internet freedom in Armenia, perhaps even more regionally in your research? And in what ways does your research help combat that kind of trend?
Thank you so much, Dan. And hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here. So just to answer the question as short as possible, I will say that I have identified a few trends based on my research on the COVID-19 tracking apps in Southeastern European and neighboring area, and doing my research on the disinformation bills in Armenia. And one of those trends concerns the fact that the governments in the region view technologies as a panacea to all the societal issues that the governments are faced with. And in case of the COVID-19 tracking apps, they also view the information, the situation with the pandemic as a wild card to introduce technological solutions without really thinking through about the human rights implications of these apps. As the civil society in all the 5 countries that I researched had specific concerns about the human rights implications. Even a year after these apps were deployed, the governments haven't really done any impact assessment. They even haven't really assessed the efficiency of these apps to see whether it was worth it to introduce apps that had such invasive privacy and not only privacy risks at play. And it just shows that the governments just sometimes think that introducing technological solutions is a good PR maybe move, or maybe they are just following the global trend, because with the COVID-19 tracking apps, as we remember, last spring, a lot of countries all over the world decided to adopt similar measures. However, the work doesn't really end there. The government had to follow up to make these apps really effective in practice, which really didn't happen in the 5 countries that I researched. On the other hand, we see a trend that a lot of countries right now are trying to legislate to fight disinformation and misinformation online. And this also doesn't, as this objective is really noble and really important for having good democratic discourse in the countries. At the same time, the governments do not really think about the implications on free speech and journalistic freedoms. Taking the case of Armenia, the government was trying to combat online disinformation in the aftermath of the Second Artsakh War that reignited last fall with Azerbaijan. And the government didn't think through how these bills will impact free speech of citizens, while online speech is one of the major ways people communicate these days. And at the same time, they introduced specific restrictions for journalists. For instance, the journalists cannot cite any online sources that cannot be identified. And if the journalist goes on doing this, they will face fines. Another bill concerns insulting or defaming a public official using a fake account. So all of this goes to show that legislative and regulatory efforts all over the world are accelerating, which will unfortunately result in fragmentation of the global internet. My project just tried to tackle two specific issues in the region, showing that the governments are trying to take a central role in trying to tackle some of the current issues on the net, but at the same time, they are not really thinking about any implications on the freedoms on the internet.
Great, thank you, Mary. Yeah, so basically we're seeing kind of more intervention by governments around the world in ways that may be noble in their inspiration, but in terms of how they play out, could be detrimental to democracy online and human rights. I now want to turn to Catherine Muya, who is a lawyer and policy officer in Kenya. She works as a tech policy fellow at the Lawyers Hub in Kenya, where she leads the organization's work on internet governance and electoral democracy. And one of the things that you've been working on is this issue of internet shutdowns, and especially internet shutdowns as it relates to periods close to elections. As we know, news and information, political organizing now often takes place online. More than half the world is connected. This is a really important space for democratic engagement. Tell us a little bit about your project and what you learned about the state of internet freedom in Kenya or in East Africa, and how you see combating it going forward.
Thank you, Dan. And so during the course of my leadership program, I did get an opportunity to study how internet shutdowns are affecting democracy in Africa. But so over 2020, so Access Now documented cases of 155 shutdowns, but then majority of these shutdowns over the last 3 years come from Africa. And in the last year, it came from countries that had a lot to do with elections. So maybe countries like Uganda that experienced complete shutdowns. Wow, I think I may have.
You can keep going, we can hear you.
Sorry, I think I yeah, okay. So I was just saying that in countries like Uganda that experience shutdowns during democracy, it really affects the possibility of journalists to report online or
Okay, I think we may have had some difficulty there with Kate. I really apologize for some of the difficulties that we're having. This is oftentimes happens when you're connecting people from continents around the world. But we'll get back to Kate. I now want to move on to Gideon. Gideon Sarpong is a journalist, a co-founder, and policy and news director at iWatch Africa. Gideon, you've been doing kind of really interesting research and analysis of something that's really concerning my organization. That's around online attacks against journalists, in particular, female journalists, but just the overall impact that this has, the amount of hate, the way that disinformation can circulate, but how this impacts the media ecosystem, and what newsrooms or what tech platforms could do to ameliorate the situation. Tell us a little bit about your project and how you see this fitting into the broader theme of internet freedom.
Thank you very much, Dan, and thank you all of you for joining today's conference. First of all, I think it's very important to state that journalists play a very, very critical and an important role in promoting democracy, especially in our parts, Western Africa. And also, journalists are very important in the democratic exchange of ideas within the online space. for the past 2 years, I've been working on tracking online vitriol and violence directed at journalists, and we've been seeing an increasing trend. Last year alone in Ghana, within the Ghanaian context, we saw over 1,000% increase in attacks directed at journalists, and some of these attacks bordered on threats, physical harm, and all of that. But much more also important, we understand the negative impacts some of these threats have on journalists. UNESCO did a report last year in which they stated that 30% of journalists, female journalists, decide to self-censor whenever they encounter some of these threats. 26% also experience mental challenges and all of that. But much more also important is that tech multinationals have not done much to deal with some of these challenges, especially in the global South context, and particularly in West Africa. And it opens up newsrooms to take on most of these challenges. And that is where my research work for the OIL program comes in. I focus mainly on developing guidelines and protocols for newsrooms to help deal with online violence directed at journalists working within their communities. So I focus mainly on West Africa, and there are a number of key things. I'll just run through them quickly. Instituting online safety coordinator, building digital literacy, also doing a risk analysis of some of these attacks on the journalists. Then the most important thing is also the support for journalists who experience online violence. So I have a guideline which has been published, which can be found on the Open Internet's Leaders platform.
Great, thank you, Gideon. And one of the points we're going to come back to it, and that is how global tech policies actually take place in different contexts and regions, and what the implications are. I would now see that Kate has joined us again. I just wanted to give you an opportunity to finish up your thoughts. You were talking about internet shutdowns in Uganda around election when we lost you. Kate.
I seem to be experiencing a shutdown of my own, but I'm okay now. So I was saying that, of course, there are shutdowns that are happening in Africa, but one of the challenges that you can identify from the continent, and I think Internews did a study on this, is even the preparation of civil society, or the preparation of people to actually, civil society in terms of measuring and circumventing, and even people or citizens within the African nation in terms of how to circumvent. But then we cannot also we cannot be aloof to the role that the government plays in shutting down the internet, because sometimes, like in Tanzania, it comes to directives directed specifically at internet service providers, asking them to shut down the internet, or coming up with maybe just some flimsy reasons to shut down the internet. And of course, the economic impacts for this, the impacts on human rights. But so what I did is try to propose more of the recommendations, and a lot of more recommendations on what we can do in terms of addressing what governments or what internet service providers can do in terms of how we can strengthen our legislative frameworks, so that we can have stronger legal frameworks that support or can allow ISP providers to decline some of these requests and other recommendations. So I'm just going to put it on hold for now.
Thank you, Kate. We did capture a lot of the really important things you mentioned there. That, I think one of it is really about, oftentimes you have directives from governments, but also it depends on the telecommunications companies that are operating in those countries. And, we also need to ask them to live up to human rights norms, and shutting down the internet, the UN General Assembly has said violates Article 19. So, let's now turn to Paula Galvez, who is currently serving as a policy advisor for the Peruvian government. She also has experience in the private sector as well. She's an adjunct professor in tech law and an active member of the Internet Society's Youth Observatory. So she has a lot of experience, and she's been working also on the rollout of COVID tracking apps in South American countries and what the privacy implications are. Paula, what did you learn in this research about where we stand in South America in regards to internet freedom?
Thank you, Dan. Hello, everyone. It's great to be with you all today. I do appreciate the opportunity to be here and share my perspectives. As Mary mentioned, in our connected world, governments around the globe are using tech with the goal to improve the lives of the citizens and better serve them, you know, but sometimes it's not tech for good. Digital authoritarianism is definitely altering the nature of an open internet. And in my case, I can say that it is by creating new forms of mass surveillance. My project under the Open Internet for Democracy Leaders program, as you mentioned, focused on exploring the extent to which contact tracing applications used across Latin America during the pandemic were designed and deployed with privacy in mind. As we all know, privacy and data protection is one of the 10 rights and principles in the right-based internet environment. So during the program, I confirmed that when the deployment of mass surveillance apps do not put the human at the center nor follow privacy by design and minimum data collection principles with excuse to mitigate the coronavirus contagion, these initiatives turn into one of the most pressing challenges of net freedom. I conducted research on the contact tracing apps developed in Colombia, Ecuador, Mexico, Peru, and Uruguay, and examined their privacy implications. Some of these used GPS geolocation, and centralized Bluetooth technology, which raised concerns around citizen privacy, and many civil society organizations raised their voices. On the other hand, only a couple of these apps' source code were available for auditing. Thus, citizens could not find vulnerabilities nor prevent potential security threats. Furthermore, most of the privacy policies were vague and lacked transparency on the implemented security measures and other components, and other very important components, such as the right to information. In conclusion, I found that many governments try to improve their apps, and it was as a result of requests from digital rights NGOs. It happened, for instance, in Colombia. But even though governments made huge efforts to comply with data protection law, some privacy considerations were still left behind. So how did I confront this? I hosted a virtual multi-stakeholder dialogue to understand various perspectives on the digital rights implication. The discussion convened key stakeholders from local business community, civil society, government, and academia from various countries in Latin America. During the event, we shared our perspectives, and we together in a constructive way, we developed key policy recommendations for governments and companies when engaging in initiatives that process personal data. We certainly believe that this will not be the unique occasion that tech solutions are deployed in a fast-paced manner. So this effort will confront this as we explore how multi-stakeholder coalitions can help support the development and implementation of new technologies that respect digital rights, and we form a coalition of key stakeholders in the region for future situations.
Great, thank you, Paula. It's really great to hear from you all. One of the things that came up in a couple of different responses as we move on to this next question is really about the connection between kind of what's happening at the global level in terms of norms and standards and what actually gets implemented, what's actually taking place around the world. Gideon, you mentioned that component in terms of how tech platforms, which do have their own overall community standards, but what's actually happening in practice in terms of targeting journalists in West Africa and the kind of online violence. I think, Kate, your research also goes to these kind of norms in terms of setting up or identifying what are kind of global norms around internet shutdowns. So I was just wondering, how do you all see the connection between global norms and localized advocacy? Is globalized standards into a local context? What are the challenges? What are the opportunities here? What are your thoughts on that question?
I think to a large extent, there is a bit of a disconnect when in terms of content moderation, in terms of protecting key stakeholders within the internet community, especially journalists and particularly female journalists. There is a bit of discontent disconnect. Most of these big platforms, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, tend to focus a bit more on the global north. And even with that, they don't do enough. So there's a bit of neglect when it comes to instituting policy decisions which meets directly the needs of regional factors and also political players within various different contexts. That is why I like this particular program, because it connects with organizations working at a grassroots level to design solutions that meet local needs.
Great. Kate?
I think I want to contribute to what Gideon just said, because he talked about having or understanding local context. And I'm going to give an example. So when organizations in the West ask for stronger content moderation policies against either when they ask for them against political people or even for just regular people who use the internet. And we can see this as a well-received thing, or we can more or less see the benefit from it. But when we come to an African context and we ask for maybe stronger content moderation in the global south, and even content moderation against political leaders because of their potential to maybe spread hate or harmful information, we see that sometimes the African context is that we have authoritarian governments. And so the political leaders in Africa might not be very welcoming to their post or their tweets being taken down. And so they're tending to see this as an act of aggression. And you can see maybe from what Gideon wrote is happening in Uganda, what he wrote and highlighted in his blog. If you get a chance, you can read it. And also what's happening in Nigeria. And I think Esther talked about it. And it's such a unique African thing that now we have to go ahead and say, okay, fine, we want content moderation, but then we don't want the government to wake up during the day and shut down like maybe Twitter for everyone. And I think that we're trying to have this stronger, we're trying to build stronger, how to say, standards in the global south and still asking for the same thing. But now we end up having to suffer more because of what we are asking for. So in terms of Nigeria, if you use Twitter as a term of protest and something like this. So I think it's important to also consider maybe local context of our unique continent, Africa, as
Got it. I think that Kate kind of cut out there, but I think we captured the overall essence of what she was trying to say, and kind of some of these and consequences of what at a global level or what being developed in, the US or Europe might seem really good, but when implemented in different contexts could really come out and be harmful. And I would also point people to Gideon's blog post on this topic. I see that Mary has her hand up. So Mary?
Thank you, Dan. I also wanted to echo what Gideon and Kate were saying in terms of the importance of understanding the local context, because again, as we talk about digital rights, we go back to the discourse on cultural relativism in human rights law, where the whole topic, the debate is on whether any global norms will be applicable effectively in a local context. And the same goes with digital rights. And just going back to the Armenian context, it was important to understand why the government decided to propose these bills. Those were mainly based on the national security concerns and the concerns from the government that this information will spread more chaos among the nation and society. Those are valid concerns, but at the same time, the government shouldn't forget about the global norms. But as with human rights in general and digital rights being human rights, we see that the governments have this push all the time against any international norm. They do not really see, not always see why this should be applicable to them and why do they need to care. And as we go forward with seeing global fragmentization and also fragmentization of global internet, we feel that on the local level, the governments are trying to step away from the global commitments at the moment, which is a very concerning trend that we see in a lot of countries. And as I mentioned before, with all these legislative initiatives in different countries and trying to regulate internet more for different various different reasons, we just have a very concerning situation right now, which unfortunately doesn't seem to stop anytime soon, unless there is some push from the local community with the help of the international community.
Great, thank you, Mary. Paula, I'm going to turn to you on this, because this is an interesting one. It seems on the one hand, sometimes international norms can be a way to kind of step up and ask governments as an advocacy tool to reach those high-level standards that are developed internationally. What's your feeling in this regard coming from South America and Peru in particular? Do you see these same concerns about governments, really backing away from international norms and standards, or are those still a really effective advocacy tool in your region?
Dan, yes, that's a very good question. And I believe it's happening. For instance, in Peru, we have had many bills that try to copy some of the bills that were presented in the United States, for instance. And as you mentioned, I used to work in private sector. I was a policy consultant to tech companies. Now I am working for the Council of Ministers. And what is needed is knowledge of technology and how is best to regulate it. Because unfortunately, our congressmen do not understand how this works, and they just think it's great to have these principles that it's being regulated in Europe or in the United States, so let's copy. But how to tackle with this? Because the most important thing here is to preserve an open internet. So how to do it? In my opinion, a multi-stakeholder engagement is key. And if I may tell you a bit more of an example that we had, and actually I was also in the government, not in the private sector, but we formed a coalition, a multi-stakeholder coalition, and it was great because we had academia, in an NGO, also the Chamber of Tech Companies in Peru is called Comex Digital. And we tried to do different activities in a constructive way to make understand the congressman why it was jeopardizing freedom of speech and privacy. We did a social media campaign. We met with congressmen several times. Also, we did a webinar with experts because that's what they need. And it was hosted by academia because it's always better when academia is a neutral part, convening stakeholders. And actually, we understood what was the concern of the Congress. And it was not the idea of how we use social media. It was the risk that children face when they are using these apps. So we presented an alternative text to tackle this concern, because we all are concerned of this, not really if we should post our economic situation, which was banned by the bill, or what was our sentimental situation. I mean, that was prohibited as well, but it really didn't tackle the problem itself. So we ended up with this proposal. The congressmen appreciated, and they thought that this kind of situation where we work together, is the best way. So from that end, it was on September. We'll keep working in that way, and I hope we can do this with the new Congress that just took office 2 days ago.
Well, that's actually a really interesting example, Paula. And in fact, it actually gets to my next question, which was precisely about, what is the role of multi-stakeholder engagement? And, obviously, multi-stakeholder engagement isn't necessarily easy. It's not easy to just build a coalition overnight. And so, but I'm wondering, apparently in this experience, find it to be very effective. And I'm wondering what the other panelists think about that, and what can we do to foster it? Are there examples that work well? Are there things that we've learned over the past year, this COVID experience when we've been isolated, that can lend themselves toward developing multi-stakeholder coalitions? Yeah, I'll throw this open to Mary, Kate, and Gideon.
I can go first. So just to share the background for my project on the COVID-19 tracking apps in Southeastern European and neighboring area, I got this idea after co-leading a project for the Southeastern European Dialogue on Internet Governance, also known as CIDIG, last summer, when we convened a multi-stakeholder working group with experts from the region and researched around 15 tracking apps in the region. And this region is quite interesting because you have countries from that are member of the European Union, such as Romania or Croatia, and then you have countries that are just member of the Council of Europe, which is another intergovernmental organization. So they fall under different global human rights regimes, and we were really curious to see how these regimes impact these different countries in terms of their obligations and how these obligations translate into the local actions when the governments decide to implement local measures. And this project went on for 3 months, and we issued recommendations addressed to the government and the developers that prepared the apps that were deployed in different countries. And I will say that this experience was very rewarding for the working group and for CIDIG community in general, because we got to know what was happening in different countries, what were the similarities and differences in approaches, in the reaction from local civil society, and the government reaction in response to these concerns from the civil society. However, in spite of the fact that this was enlightening to know and to learn from each other, at the same time, after we issued the recommendations, we did not really get much feedback from the stakeholders. So my point being that having a multi-stakeholder working group or community is a great start, but also the group needs to think about what happens after they issue their recommendations or they complete their advocacy project, because still, I believe that especially in this region, the government and generally society doesn't really fully comprehend the importance of having multi-stakeholder groups working on anything related to the internet and digital freedoms. But there is some progress, but there is more work to be done in a nutshell.
Got it. So, I mean, we definitely see there are benefits, especially in knowledge sharing and peer-to-peer learning, but it's not a panacea that by itself can necessarily fix it. It's just a means to an end, a process. Yeah. Kate, what are your thinking and experience in this regard?
So I'm going to give 2 examples. The first I'm going to give with the digital ID framework in Kenya. And then the second is a festival that we run at the Lawyers Hub that's called the Africa Law Tech Festival. So I'll start with the latter. So the Africa Law Tech Festival brings together different types of stakeholders in the African region or sub-Saharan region to just more or less talk about internet governance issues and digital rights issues that affect us as a continent. And so we just concluded this year's festival in, I think this month, July, and we brought together different stakeholders from ITU, ICANN, data protection authorities in Mauritius, just everyone, maybe from individuals and to people who want to learn about these things. And so when you bring different people together, you get to learn different perspectives across the continent on different things. But as Mary is saying, you need to have something to go on or something that moves forward after you're doing, when you have this sort of multi-stakeholder engagement. And so what we did is create an association that's called the African Law Tech Association that continues this dialogue, or more or less continues these projects. And now we're trying to figure out how to harness this important group of people over the next year and even throughout our work. But now the second example that I'll give is the digital ID framework in Kenya. And when Kenya was implementing the NIMS or Huduma number, we as civil society had to come together to more or less to more or less challenge this act in court. And what I learned from this is there are a lot of different stakeholders, from civil society, from people who are providing technical expertise in terms of the privacy aspects of the solutions. And what I see is, even after we got more or less a favorable judgment from the court, and is still being appealed, some aspects of that judgment is still being appealed in court right now. The African Union is trying to implement a digital ID framework, and I can see the same sort of stakeholder engagement pushing for more inclusivity in that framework. And so I think that what Mary is saying is important in terms of knowing what is the end objective, because for us, for example, from that project, we were able to come up with something we call the NIMS Coalition, which is basically a coalition of all the stakeholders that work on digital identity in Kenya, and who always come together to say, when they're implementing the law, to more or less just look at it and analyze it and see if this is good or something bad, or how do we change the law, and speak with one voice and unity when it comes to digital ID. And I can see the same playing out within even the AU discussions that we're having now, or we had yesterday, that more or less deal with this question. So I agree with Mary, and I think I'll just leave it at that for now.
Great, thank you, Kate. And Gideon, very quick, do you have something to add on this? Would you need to move on?
Yeah, I think mainly Kate and Mary have said pretty much about this. For me, I think that within these discussions at the highest level, we must always find a way to connect it at the national and the regional level, and it has to do with identifying the right actors and players and continuous institutional engagement with these players.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Gideon. The participants. Yes, this presentation is being recorded, and it'll be shared on YouTube, so everyone will be able to watch it later. And then also, I just want to remind you that we'll be having questions and answers very shortly. So if you want to put your question and Zoom, or also if you want to raise your hand in the audience, and we can unmute you and have you ask your question. So we're going to have one more round of questions for the audience member, and then we're going to get to all the questions that you have for this group. But this final question that I have, and I'll ask you to be brief again, is what, we know that internet freedom is under attack. We know that it's challenging to do the work that you're doing. It requires a lot of building networks, coalitions, multi-stakeholder engagement. It's not easy. Oftentimes the information we need is not there, from either the tech. What assistance from kind of international actors, whether it be donors or implementers, the people who are really behind, other democracy advocates in general, what can be done to strengthen the work that you're doing? I'll pass it to Mary first for this one.
Sure, thanks, Dan. So I will just start by saying that after the COVID-19 pandemic, which is still not over, unfortunately, but for the last 1.5 years, we have seen the exacerbation of all the problems and issues that digital rights activists were raising concerns about before the pandemic, which means that moving forward, we need to build a stronger local activism that will tackle these different concerns. And as going back to the points that we discussed a bit earlier, given the current situation when the government are trying to legislate the internet more, it is important also to know that the government are not only copying from each other verbatim the laws that might seem nice or useful or effective, as Paula was saying, but also they are trying to copy all the laws that are more repressive or authoritarian. Let's take the example of the Turkish social media law, which was adopted, if I'm not mistaken, last year, or it came into force last year. And then we see similar law adopted in Russia just a month ago that is going to try to regulate foreign internet entities that provide services on the internet to Russian users. So this means that we cannot just leave any local legislative initiative or any development in one country unnoticed. And going back to your question, my view is that, of course, financial assistance is a big one, but in addition to that, we need to have more. We would love to have more support in terms of solidarity and advocacy campaigns that will be done on a more global level. This means that when there is a law concern that is very concerning, let's say in Armenia, we would love to see more support from the global community that will raise their voice against such initiatives, because once these laws are adopted and they seem to be working for the government, other governments will be really happy to just copy this one, and then we'll have more issues and more problems trying to tackle this in a few other places rather than trying to join forces and shut this down in the place that tries to initiate this. So again, going back to my previous point, I would also love to have more opportunities to exchange knowledge and skills and learn from each other, because we are facing similar problems, and knowing how different people manage to tackle different concerns is really important in local advocacy. Thank you.
Great. No, that's really interesting. And like you say, solidarity is important, because what happens today in Armenia might be internet really high. So your thoughts can be done to support these types.
Then I'm not sure who you called out.
Yeah, because it was Chappie, sorry.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, it was Kate.
Okay. I'm gonna keep it brief. I think Mary talked about the capacity, but I'm gonna say, as the Lawyers Hub, we are running the Africa Digital Policy Institute, where we are trying to upscale the learning and the knowledge of digital rights and internet governance issues across the continent. So I would say that my direct help would maybe come to the institute in terms of, you could offer funding, or you could offer particular expertise in terms of just offering material for that. So I would keep it brief and just say that.
Great, thank you, Kate. And Gideon.
For me, there are three main points. There should be effort in studying regional, local nuances and understanding how solutions work within local contexts. Also, active and continuous engagement with grassroots rights groups to design solutions that meet specific regions and also countries. And finally, institutional engagement. So for my work, I've had a team of experts with SEMA, and of course, Dan, you're part of it, who have guided me throughout the process. And that is what I think we need.
Great, thank you, Gideon. And Paula, final thoughts. What needs to be done? You've seen this from the private sector. You're now in the government. So I think your vision is really comprehensive. What are your thoughts?
Thanks, Dan. I believe more than funding, we need two main things. First, understanding the issue. I think we've heard it's around the globe, not just Latin America. Locals probably already have a pretty good idea of what the issue is, why the determined bill is a threat to internet freedom. However, it is important to develop a deeper understanding of the issue, because when we want to advocate, we will be asked why it is jeopardizing, because my particular need as a congressman is strong, it's children, it's safety, whatever. So I believe that donors can help us here, because and I can draft from my own experience. When I started, I didn't know how to respond to government policy. I had never produced a policy memo. And last year, SAIP released an interactive online training course on how to create an enabled environment for digital economy. So those kind of online courses are helpful. Also, when they organize webinars, and also it goes to the second main thing that we need. It's to recognize allies and connect with them. As Mary mentioned, we really need to develop a multi-stakeholder map. It's one of the most important things of any advocacy campaign. So yes, if donors can help us meet with experts, with important allies, that's great. And actually I found that in this Open Internet Leaders program, I had a very good multi-stakeholder dialogue, because SIPE helped me to connect with important local business community members, and also encourage that we build a community local. I do it, for instance, with the youth IDF in Peru, and that's when we have a community and we have a WhatsApp group, and we say, hey guys, have you seen this bill? And there is people from the academia, from NGOs, and also some students that are maybe studying, I don't know, architecture, but they find very concerning what is happening around the internet, and they say, I can support, I can do social media campaign, I can go and connect you with a friend of mine who's working in the Congress. So yes, building a community is one of the most important things. And as Mary mentioned, it's not just to do the campaign and that. We have to build a monitoring mechanism that ensures that the process is kept on track. It's just not the webinar or the meeting itself. It's a very long process.
Great. Thank you, Paolo. That's a really important point. It's about maintenance. It's not just about, the same issue I think we talked about with multi-stakeholder coalitions. It's about understanding what the long-term vision is and what the goal is, but that includes kind of maintenance throughout. For people who are interested in mapping these types of, stakeholder mapping, which Paolo mentioned, I would just recommend the Open Internet for Democracy Advocacy Playbook, which really goes step by step through how you would go doing about that. So if you want to check that out, that's at openinternet.global. And we're now going to take some questions. We're actually, I see a number of questions. Just for the sake of efficiency, if I'm going to call on Mark Nelson first, who is the Senior Director of SEMA. If the other people who are in line, because we have a lot of people online, if you could submit your questions via the Q&A feature, because some of these questions may be similar and we can kind of tackle them all at once. So let's hear from Mark Nelson, please. Mark?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I was losing connectivity, so I didn't hear the question.
Okay. Well, we thought you had a question for our speakers.
No, I didn't.
Apologies.
Thing's going wrong with my computer this morning, so I'm going in and out.
Oh, okay. Well, apologies for that. We saw the hand raised. We have been dealing with a number of tech issues. I think all of us have today. So apologies about that. Then let's go to the first question that we have. And this is one that is specifically for Kate and Gideon. How have the governments in East and West Africa performed in terms of adoption and application of African regional norms and standards? So we're not talking about necessarily international ones, but just even African ones. And what are the prospects for success using regional mechanisms? I think this is a really great question because, regional mechanisms, I think, pose even more, if we're talking about going from local to global, that can be a big jump. But when we talk about going to regional, well, there seems to be a little bit more tailored components to this. So, Kate, I know you have something to say about this. What are your thoughts?
Actually, I have a lot to say about this. I will say it depends on the framework. So I will say that frameworks like the Human Convention on Human People's Rights that they mentioned have some aspects of digital rights with them and some aspects without. So they did formulate some African principles on internet freedom and something that now more or less is used. But then we have to look at the politics and dynamics of using those frameworks, because at some point they're not exclusively binding. So I'll give an example of the Malabo Convention, which is the African Convention on data protection and cybersecurity, which has not yet come into force because out of 55 countries, it has only been ratified by 8. At the meeting that I just had before with the African Union, they said that 2 more additional countries are looking to ratify the convention. But that has not really met standards in terms of guaranteeing privacy. And it does really have some important provisions when it comes to maybe what standards for data protection or data protection authorities. So I would say that it really depends on the convention, and also because it depends on the convention on the rights framework, and it depends more or less on that. I would say that when we were doing the NIMS decision or the NIMS court case, some decision that was raised, the government said they didn't comply with it because it wasn't a must. So yeah, because you see some frameworks are not mandatory, or some decisions are not mandatory, they're just persuasive and they're not binding. So to that extent, maybe that might reduce the efficacy of some conventions, but I hope we move towards the more, I would say that more things are economically driven. So initiatives like Smart Africa, which is the digital growth and economy and everything, 2063 agenda is more economically driven. But I do hope that we're trying to push for a digital rights or human rights centered development, if I would say that.
Great, thanks, Kate. And now over to you, Gideon, because this question is for you. And one of the things that popped into my mind was this recent ruling by Ecowas, which is a regional body in West Africa that kind of came out against that Twitter shutdown in Nigeria. And I think many people saw that as, a positive step by a regional body. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, indeed, we were all pretty much happy about it, but we also understand that ECOWAS doesn't have the power to really back up some of these rulings. So the Nigerian government decided basically to ignore it. So these are broadly some of the challenges. And also, I mean, West Africa, we have 16 countries, and every country mainly decides on how it wants to look at most of these frameworks. But broadly, I think with the African Charter, it has a portion which deals with digital rights, which all the 16 countries have subscribed to. But much more important, in Ghana, we have a very vibrant civil society institutions in general, and we are very, very engaged when it comes to data governance issues, data rights issues, and we are actually putting in place the right frameworks. Last year, my institution, in collaboration with the Ghana Police, worked with the National Rights Body in Ghana to help them mainstream digital rights as part of their activities. And I think that some of these things help regionally and also locally. But when it comes to the broader frameworks, it depends on various countries and how they want to go about it.
Great, thank you. We have another question here, which I think is a really good one. And that is, how do we actively engage the civic society and government on infusing flexible legislative principles on internet freedoms? And, if I understand this correctly, it's really about, sometimes law can be so specific that it can have kind of unintended consequences. Ultimately, the kind of freedoms that we want to enjoy online need kind of flexibility in the law. So you don't want to, kind of tie things down too closely. We have a number of lawyers on our panel right now, so I'm sure they have thoughts on that. I'll pass it to Mary. How do you do this? How is this balancing act between making sure things are protected as well as not, getting yourself into a straitjacket that might in the future be counterproductive?
Well, this is actually a great question. And I will start by saying that I don't believe everything needs to be regulated. That is a big one and a big topic of discussion at the moment in many different regions. But I also want to go back and echo Paula's point when she mentioned that the congressmen might not even know what they are legislating on. This is a big concern in a lot of countries. So I believe that is the place to start. First, understanding what they are trying to legislate on and why this is important is the way to have better laws. Understanding how these things work, how the technology works, or how the internet works for a specific issue is a very important starting point for legislators, which is not the case, as I mentioned, in a lot of countries. And next, understanding why we need to legislate this at all. Is it possible that we maybe need more digital literacy, skills enhancement, rather than having a law that will set potentially rigid rules that will have implications for digital rights? So these are the concerns that I believe civil society, and not only all stakeholders, are best placed to think about and push forward. And just thinking that regulation is the solution, I don't think is the right way to move forward. But that is a trend that we are seeing these days, unfortunately.
Interesting. Are there any other thoughts? Kate, what's your reaction? Regulations isn't necessarily the solution to everything.
I think so. I want to agree. Sometimes it's not really a must, but when we do regulate, I would say that I agree with Mary, because the legislation that we have now, we had sometime back in 2019. It was called the social media bill or something like that, was trying to regulate a lot of things that have to do with internet freedom and expression. But I would say that from the continent, even looking at Uganda and Kenya, legislation that taxes the internet, for example, is really problematic, because sometimes the Kenya Revenue Authority has targets that they want to meet in terms of revenue collection, and then they also see these big companies as eroding some of our money. And yes, they do need to tax, but they tax these things in such a way that makes the internet expensive for us. For example, by increasing access, that makes the internet expensive for us. And in Uganda, they now have the general internet tax, and they were just telling us how it makes internet and everything so expensive. So I think to some extent, we need to be very careful about how we craft legislation. Sometimes the legislation just goes overboard and goes beyond what it's really supposed to do. So I think understanding is important. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Kate. Yeah, and just to build off of that, the case of the Ugandan social media taxes, internet tax, actually one of our past open internet leaders did a report on that topic. And, we immediately think about the cost in terms of, well, users are going to have to pay more, right? Because when we're talking about these taxes, it's not on Facebook, it's on users who are using these applications in Uganda. And one of the impacts that she found, Juliet Danfuka from CIPEZA, was that it actually diminished the ability of journalists who often relied on platforms to communicate with sources. So these things that seem like, oh, it's just a revenue generating thing, actually can be used to kind of curtail, stifle freedom of expression and press freedom too. So that I just want to highlight that, because it's a really good point that these kind of have knock-on effects, which is another reason why multi-stakeholder engagement around these issues is really, really key. I just want to remind everyone in the audience, we've gone a little bit over. We have a little bit more time. If you have a question for these four excellent speakers, make sure to put it in the Q&A box now, so that we can get to the end. Paula and Gideon, you're free to answer this question as well, but I'm also going to pose one that Mark has put in the question. What can international donors and big democratic powers do? And this is a question we kind of dealt with a little bit, but the new angle here is, is it funding, or is it stronger political engagement with your governments in global internet organizations? I think that's the key question here, is like, what, it's one thing to give funding or capacity building, but what kind of engagement do you hope that other democratic governments would do in these international organizations? And I see Paula has her hand up on this one, but go ahead.
Thank you, Dan. It's a great question, and I would like to mix both questions, because what Blessed, what he asked, or she, I'm not sure, Blessed asked, is really related to it, because we really need a lot of stars so the sky can shine. So we just need you said how to engage, just be a change maker and raise your voice. How? We got a lot of ways. One is connecting with some donors or international organizations, because local governments, and I don't know if I'm mistaken, but in Latin America it happens, they tend to listen to international organizations. And actually, the Internet Society has this Internet Impact Assessment tool, which I found very, very useful, because when we have some trouble with bills, we request the policymakers that they listen to experts. And unfortunately, they believe that experts are not the local ones, but they listen more to international ones. So, Mark, we do need the donors and organizations to get involved. And it's great when we go locals with the international organizations together. We did that with ISOC, and they tend to understand, oh, why is end-to-end encryption working? Why we shouldn't be banning this? Because they see the movie in a complete way, you know? So yeah, it's not only funding. Actually, when we get funding, sometimes we misuse it.
Great. And I see Kate has her hand up. And actually also before I want to throw the next question to you because it's about Zambia and kind of what do we do? There's an upcoming election in Zambia. I know this is something you work on, so maybe you can tackle that question from Humphrey as well.
Okay, so I'll start with the one on funding, because the one on what donors can do. I agree that funding is an important aspect because some of the work that we do cannot be done without funding, but also capacity. I have read research where maybe international actors are able to collaborate. So for example, in Uganda, I read a research where Unwanted Witness collaborated with Privacy International, and the research outcome was really good because they were able to share this sort of technical expertise. So for digital rights organizations in the Global South, I would say that technical expertise is really expensive. To find people with that to maybe just interrogate the technical standards and aspects of it. And I'm seeing global research like the one Amnesty is doing when it comes to NSO and all these things. And I feel like we would benefit from that to sort of like engagement and capacity building. So I think that's just something to point out. With regards to Humphrey's question, I was not done reading it. It's quite long, but he says they have a cybersecurity, they have a cybercrime instrument, and wait, how can we hold, say, the Electoral Commission for any eminent fraudulent registered voters, particularly ghost voters and refugees? How do we engage government and put up an open policy for information? Okay, I would give the Kenyan context of how I would answer this question if it was in Kenya. So we do have an Access to Information Act in Kenya that allows you to access the voter register, and our electoral commission, it's called the Independent Electoral Boundaries Commission, usually gives a clean data set of all the registered voters that you can be able to maybe verify. I would think that maybe if you have a similar thing, that you have an access to information law, or you can maybe do an access to information request to more or less see. And ours usually complies with those requests. So maybe if you're asking it for a good reason, they'll give it to you, or just basically because it's your right and they're a public authority. They can't deny it to you because it's in the Constitution, so they'll give it to you. What about about the cybercrime legislation? So this happens a lot when people, like I see it in Uganda, I saw it in Uganda where cybercrime legislation was used to harass activists. What I do see is maybe proactively challenging the pieces of legislation that you think are infringing on human rights or digital freedoms. So for example, in Kenya, I'll give the example of our cybercrime law when it was passed in 2018 and did not come into force until late last year, 2020. Because the whole time, certain sections of it were being challenged because of threats to digital freedom. And even when the High Court did validated those sections, it's now a matter in the Court of Appeal. And so we are trying to more or less just get rid of those bad things, or the bad fruits of the apple, because at the end of it all, we do need cybercrime laws, but the way in which they're designed or worded is what's problematic. So I think that maybe getting ahead of that before time, or maybe just trying to challenge the constitutionality of those provisions, even when you're arrested, is something that you can consider.
Great, thank you very much. That's really helpful. I mean, obviously I can see the pattern that Humphrey's describing, right? Government knows the election's coming up, a sensitive election, institute a cybercrimes law, there you go. We're going to have to wrap up here soon. So we're just going to have one more round, and I just want to kind of hear kind of what your concluding thoughts are, about what your feelings about what is the future of open internet policy around the world and the work that you're doing. And I'm going to, I see that Gideon has his hand up, so he'll kick us off.
I mean, first of all, I think a couple of weeks ago, something happened which for me was quite significant. Now, the kind of tax system we have globally, the non-physical rules, non-presence, physical presence rules specifically, has contributed to why a lot of multinational companies can decide to be based in a certain parts of the world and operate from those regions and not really bother about other regions, although they make quite significant amounts of money from those regions. So then the G20 meeting recently agreed that 15% payment of tax would apply in all jurisdictions around the world. And if this actually comes into play, that means that profit making by most of these players will be decentralized, which is quite significant, and also drive investments into areas where they have been non-existent for some time. And I think that it is very, very important development we have to look at. But also on the second point, I think that democratic governments must really help institute rules and laws that will hold most of these tech companies accountable for their platforms, because we know that they have the financial muscle to really deal with the issues we are talking about, because they have billions of dollars stacked in tax havens all around the world. So that is a major thing we can look at. And finally, Australia introduced a new legislation sometime getting to the end of last year, which would help local news outlets, mainly global tech multinationals, who pay tax, which will be redistributed for news outlets. And I think that is something we have to also take a critical look at, because the advertisements, the traditional advertisement models has changed a lot, and most of these monies are being made by tech multinationals, and they must contribute their bits also to local developments.
Thank you, Gideon. Kate?
Wow, I was just trying to answer Damon's question in the chat. But I think that the future of internet democracy is, I think I said this once before, the threats to internet are multicultural and boundaryless. So we all have a role to play in terms of advocating for internet freedom. What we need to do is just collaborate together, and we need to just amplify our advocacy. I think that's usually a challenge a lot for civil society in terms of amplifying advocacy and promoting awareness even within our own regions and communities. So I think that that's an important step in fighting for internet freedom.
Great. Paula?
Thanks. I will keep it short. I will just say we need more people involved. So I hope our experiences kind of inspired some of you or everyone here. We need people that tries to understand what is happening, because I just believe this is the beginning. I mean, this and the next year, there will be more intentions to regulate what is going on regarding the internet, because I don't know if you heard, but now that Jeff Bezos go to travel outside the planet, they say, oh, it's important, now we should be taxing that. So yeah, it will not end soon, but we need to be change makers. And what I learned from the multi-stakeholder dialogue I organized during the project is that we all need to be in contact, because that organization from Brazil and from Uruguay mentioned, hey, we need to keep in contact. It's not happening locally, it's around the globe, you know? So try to form a multi-stakeholder map and keep in contact. If you're a youth or you're eligible to this kind of programs, apply, because it's great to stay in contact. I mean, the program is finishing, it's coming to an end, but I am sure that I will stay in touch with Gideon, Mary, you, Dan, people from SIPE. So yes, we should be engaged and try to participate in the IGF, RightsCon, and all the activities, because we need more people to speak their minds and to preserve the open internet. Thank you.
Thank you, Paola. Final word from Mary.
Thank you, Dan. So I guess I'll just be echoing my colleagues here, but just to keep it short, I see the future for democratic internet to be very challenging, but I'm also really hopeful, because I believe that once we really realize that joining forces will take us further than trying to tackle all the challenges on our own, as those are happening in a lot of countries, that will be the turning moment, because I believe that a lot of the developments are similar, however, are also a bit different based on the local context. At the same time, as I said before, I think that it is crucial to have more solidarity and work together for advocacy projects, for sharing different tools that were successful or were not successful in different contexts, so that all of us working on local level will have the chance to implement those or propose changes to those that will be relevant to our local context. But basically my point is, coming together this is the time to come together and work to keep the internet open, because it is under threat, unfortunately. And this is the trend that we are experiencing. And I also want to echo my colleagues to say thank you a lot for our host organizations for this initiative, because it really taught me a lot personally, and I had the chance to work on the issues that I care a lot about. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mary. It's really, this has been a really interesting conversation. I think, some key takeaways are really about the power that multi-stakeholder work can have, but that it also takes maintenance, it takes resources, it takes engagement, which is hard. I think we also learned about the power of international solidarity. So this has to do with that question of what can donors do? It's financial support, solidarity in that regards, in terms of technical expertise. How can we make sure that people who are really passionate about these issues have the technical expertise to develop projects and policies that can respond to the issues? But then also about solidarity and making sure that, when something happens in one place, we stand up for it in other places, because it could happen here next. And also just about the knowledge and kind of the inspiration that we get from working with people tackling these issues in different regions. And that's one of the things, for me working on this project, it's really about working with people like the four of you who give me inspiration. And I think this conversation has been really interesting. We've heard a lot of different perspectives. So I really want to thank you for your time. And, if the audience was here live, we'd all give you a round of applause. So virtual round of applause for you. If anyone hasn't checked out the website and you want to learn more about the Open Internet for Democracy initiative, please visit it, https://openinternet.global. You can learn more about all these fantastic people here, the research they've done. Our other fellows have been doing great research too. And we'll look forward to hearing you in the future.